Constitution of the Indigenous Peoples of Turtle Island. Preamble. We, the Indigenous Peoples of Turtle Island, in order to reclaim our sovereignty, protect our lands, preserve our cultures, ensure justice, equality, and harmony for all our peoples, establish this Constitution as the supreme law of our nations. This Constitution affirms our inherent rights as the original stewards of these lands and commits to the preservation and restoration of our cultural, spiritual, and natural heritage. Article 1, Sovereignty and Ownership of Lands. Sovereignty. All indigenous nations represented within this Constitution retain full sovereignty and self-determination. Each nation has the right to govern its own affairs, establish its own systems of governance, and maintain its cultural traditions and customs. Ownership of lands. The lands known as Turtle Island, inclusive of the continental territories of what is now called North America, are recognized as the ancestral and inalienable lands of the indigenous peoples. All lands traditionally inhabited or used by indigenous nations are affirmed as their collective property. The use, stewardship, and care of these lands are to be determined by the respective nations. Reparations of land. The federal government and other non-indigenous entities shall return lands unjustly taken from indigenous nations. A commission will be established to assess claims and oversee the restitution of lands, resources, and other reparations. Where physical return is not possible, appropriate compensation shall be made. Article 2, Rights and Freedom, Civil Rights. All members of indigenous nations are guaranteed equal protection under this Constitution, including the right to life, liberty, and security. No person shall be subjected to discrimination based on race, color, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or spiritual beliefs. Freedom of speech and expression. Every person shall have the right to freedom of thought, speech, expression, and assembly, provided these rights do not infringe upon the rights of others or violate the laws of the respective indigenous nations. Right to bear arms. All members of indigenous nations have the right to bear arms for personal defense, the protection of their communities, and for traditional hunting practices. This right shall not be infringed except under laws duly established by each nation. Right to education. Every member of indigenous nations has the right to access free and culturally relevant education that respects and integrates indigenous knowledge, languages, and traditions. Education systems shall be designed and controlled by indigenous nations to reflect their values and histories. Feminine liberty and equality. All members of indigenous nations, regardless of gender, are entitled to equal rights and protections. Indigenous women, two-spirit, and non-binary people have the right to participate fully in the political, social, and cultural life of their communities. Gender-based violence, discrimination, and exploitation are strictly prohibited and shall be punished accordingly. Article 3, Governance Structure. The Grand Council of Nations. The supreme legislative body shall be known as the Grand Council of Nations, consisting of representatives from each indigenous nation on Turtle Island. Each nation shall have the right to appoint or elect their representatives according to their own customs and governance systems. The Senate. The Senate shall serve as a body representing the collective interests of all indigenous nations, with each nation having equal representation. The Senate shall have the authority to review and approve legislation, treaties, and international agreements. The House of Representatives. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members proportionally representing the population of each nation. The House shall have the authority to propose laws, budgets, and policies impacting the collective governance of Turtle Island. Article 4, redistribution of wealth and resources. Redistribution of wealth. There shall be a just and equitable redistribution of wealth generated from the lands, resources, and intellectual property of indigenous peoples. A portion of revenues from natural resources, tourism, and other economic activities conducted on indigenous lands shall be directed towards community development, education, healthcare, and cultural preservation, economic justice, and development. Indigenous nations shall have the right to establish economic policies and systems that reflect their values, traditions, and priorities. Measures shall be taken to ensure fair compensation, labor rights, and economic opportunities for all members of indigenous nations. Article 5, Justice, Equality, and Tolerance. Justice and equality. All legal systems and judicial processes within indigenous nations shall be based on principles of fairness, justice, and equality. Indigenous nations shall have the right to establish their own legal systems, incorporating traditional laws, customs, and restorative justice practices, tolerance, and respect for diversity. All members of indigenous nations and other residents on Turtle Island are expected to uphold the values of tolerance, respect, and mutual understanding. Discrimination, racism, and hate-based actions are strictly prohibited and shall be met with appropriate legal consequences. Article 6, Amendment Process, Amendment Procedure. This Constitution may be amended through a process initiated by any member of the Grand Council of Nations. Proposed amendments must be approved by a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House of Representatives and ratified by a majority of indigenous nations through their respective governance structures. Article 7, Ratification and Adoption. Ratification. This Constitution shall be considered ratified and effective upon the approval of 2/3 of the recognized indigenous nations on Turtle Island through their own governing processes and mechanism. Adoption. Upon ratification, this Constitution shall become the supreme law governing the collective rights, responsibilities, and governance of indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, superseding any previous agreements or documents that are inconsistent with its principles. Conclusion. This Constitution embodies our commitment to sovereignty, justice, and unity for all indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. It is a living document that seeks to honor our past, protect our present, and ensure a prosperous and harmonious future for all generations to come. This draft aims to provide a comprehensive framework while acknowledging the diversity and autonomy of the various indigenous nations across Turtle Island. It incorporates elements of self-governance, civil rights, cultural preservation, and economic justice in alignment with the unique traditions and aspirations of the indigenous peoples.